Welcome to The Code. Construction, design, and engineering. This is India's #1 construction podcast.
Subhani, you started your journey from NID to Ogilvy to Tata Interactive, and then took this huge leap to work with craftsmen and in the villages, especially, right? What triggered that moment when you said, I'm going to leave corporate design and start something rooted in India's heritage?
Um, so, I was brought up in a pretty idealistic Bengali environment. And my mother is a social worker. And all my aunts, uncles, father were all creative people, fond of writing, fond of reading, etc. And I was brought up on the principles of, making a difference.
Okay.
So when I was 16, 17, 18, I've traveled quite a lot even by then. And, I was able to see a lot of India even when I was young. So I always felt that, I grow up and do something that makes a difference to people, something that, creates more meaning for me personally as well. And so while I had a truly good corporate experience, both at Ogilvy and at Tata Interactive Systems, I always felt that there's more to life. And that there is something that I still need to do to make my own life more meaningful. So when I started to work with the Tatas, I was talking to my professor in NID, and I was asking him that how can I do something that makes a difference. And he works with the artisan sector and with the craft sector extensively, Professor M.P. Ranjan. And he said that you have this technology field that you're working in, and you're working with this digital world. Why don't you use that to advantage the artisans of India? Why don't you work in such a way that the artisans have a direct access to the markets? So create a .com. The whole .com boom is happening right now. Create a .com for them to come into the markets directly.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about it, and it made a lot of sense. And that is where I kind of jumped into this world of crafts and artisans and tried to create what was India's very early .coms in the craft sector. And of course, my interest in crafts just grew from there. And I went back to, when as a child, I saw artisans in villages doing things, selling creative stuff, selling stoneware, selling brassware. Everything looks
Which
like...
city did you grow up in?
I grew up in Bombay.
Okay.
But I traveled to a lot of little
Sure.
places. And I just got fascinated with the world of crafts and handicrafts. And so the journey started.
Yeah. When did you start with the business?
So I started a .com business in the year 2000.
Okay.
And this was incubated by the Tata companies.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't make it to the big round of funding that .coms usually had at that time.
Okay.
Mainly because people felt that the crafts business is not scalable. I mean, the .com, people were looking for, like, in 3 years, you multiply X number of times, right?
Yeah.
And they felt that this whole unstructured industry was not capable of scaling fast enough.
Yeah.
And but we ran the .com, and we ran it quite successfully for 7 years. I had a great team. I had a great partner. And we did a lot of interesting work even by ourselves in the .com space.
I think the 2 decades from like the 90s and the early 2000s, they were a little ignorant of the Indian craftsmen in any case, right? So
Yeah.
there was a major setback there.
Yeah.
When you started this, when you started Craftsbridge and later Baya, what was the biggest misconception that people had about Indian crafts and artisans?
When I started this, the biggest misconception, I think, was 2 or 3 things. I think people felt that crafts was cheap. Anything that you get from the rural villages or made by artisans must be cheap. And that's not true, because actually some of the crafts are so incredible and so intense in its effort and workmanship that they actually deserve a far, far better price than what they can generate. In fact, crafts need that value to be built. So this was one misconception that I faced. And the other thing that I faced was, that these are traditional products and we live in a very contemporary world. We want to see something new.
Yeah.
So the innovation that some of these products needed, or to make it more contextual for today's time, was missing at that time. There's a lot more of it happening now, but during that period, you typically got what the artisans used to produce for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
There wasn't that much design innovation or reimagining of their work. So these were, I think, two challenges that we faced. And of course, the whole thing of, it being difficult to access artisans, they live far away.
Yeah.
Communication sometimes is an issue, because you think in technical drawings and you think in terms of English language, but they live in a different world, and communicating with them what you want or need is a challenge. But it's great fun to learn their life and how they think, and approach it from their way of being as well.
So Shubhani, like 25 years later,
Yeah.
are the challenges the same, or have they evolved into something else now today?
So that's a great question. Actually, I see a lot more interest in craft products now.
Okay.
I see a lot of cultural products. I see a lot of companies that are working with artisans across India. I see a lot of innovation by designers, whether it's in the textiles field or it's in other types of crafts. A lot of work has happened in the last 25 years. And the sector is sort of opened up to being in the market much more assertively than it has ever in the past. So that is one thing that I have seen. And what was your other question?
I mean, are we becoming more, how do you say, do you think we've changed in the way how we perceive design in India now? In terms of, are we open to accepting our own cultural heritage as such?
I think there's more pride in our cultural heritage, but it's a very superficial kind of like wearing a jacket of your identity. It's not really digging deep, because only when you take an interest, a deeper interest in the cultural context of the crafts, or when you travel and you meet an artisan, or when you spend time trying to understand how a product is made, what is the significance of that product, why is it made in a particular way and in that geography, why is it sustainable, all of these questions need to be taken into consideration when you look at the handicraft sector. It's a complex sector, and only when you dig in deeper does that identity really start to matter, and you make sense of this whole thing.
Right.
So I feel that a lot of like they say, greenwashing happens, a lot of craft washing happens now. But I think that as we dig deeper, as we understand truly the context of rural India and how these artisans work, the sense of a deeper identity will emerge.
Do you think the Indian consumer now equates Indian crafts and cultural heritage to luxury at all? Or are we still not willing to pay the prices for within the country for Indian art and for Indian,
So I think that the consumer is changing.
Okay.
I think there is definitely a larger segment of people willing to pay and wanting to buy artisanal products and pay for the value for them. Has it really permeated in a more significant way? I think there's a long way to go. I think that majority of the people still have to understand that this is a national treasure, and opt for this, rather than machine-made products, opt for hand products. After understanding that actually handmade products are a category that is superior in its own way. its own aesthetics, and it has its own soulfulness, and it has actually superiority in terms of sometimes even the end product or quality or the longevity of the product, because it goes through this whole handmade process, and a person is at the end of this product making it.
Right.
So the day the people realize this, I think they will value handmade products much more.
I think we live in a world which holds more value to creation of value. So what I'm trying to say is that people would still put in the money, but as an investment.
Yeah.
They think if it grows, and then it's a great collection to have. And maybe I grew 100x in like 5 years collecting art or collecting any craft,
Yeah.
which is Indian handmade. Or while I do think that it is probably better respected outside the country, I think our mindset is yet to evolve. Luxury still means European to us, doesn't it? We still are the slaves within our own European mindset of, colonial rule of all these years. But yeah, it's a very interesting transition, and I'm sure you've been a part of that transition for like 25 years, and you've been like, viewing it from a closer lens.
Definitely.
You've often said that innovation isn't about technology; it's about connection. What do you mean by that in the context of design today?
So, I put it in the context of today's world where, technology, especially AI, is playing a big role in everything that we do. We are designing a large section of our work using AI interpretations. We are looking at AI to give us answers to many things. But unless we have the empathy and the connect to both our people that we sell to and the people we buy from, the innovation is only surface level. I think that it's all about a certain logical process that technology takes you through. And you may get a product which is sort of, logically pure and comes out kind of a follow, meets the checklist. But in a larger contextual way, when you look at it, does it really create more happiness? Is it really building more sustainability? Is it really building a better world? Is it really making people feel more humane? Is it making people feel less anxious and more connected? All of that matters. So innovation without this context, to me, is not something that is good for
soulless,
us
isn't
in the
it?
long run.
It is soulless, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's soulless. And, without that soul, without that context of being humane, innovation doesn't really have much meaning.
Right. Very interesting. I want to talk to you about the art of design, the process, practice, the philosophy.
Yeah.
How do you begin when you get a large brief, especially say an airport or a corporate office or a corporate headquarters? Is it art first or is it a story first?
So it's always the story first for us.
Okay.
We are not self-expressing when we create art. We are actually expressing someone's story. So it could be the story of a brand, it could be the beliefs of an individual, it could be the values of a company, it could be for a hotel, the customers that come and stay in the hotel, what do they want to take away? What are the stories that they want to take away from that place? All of that becomes the starting point. So first is the story of what we are trying to say, what we are trying to create. And then comes the creation of the art, following the story.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of like getting a context within architecture and then working on that context and that brief.
Yeah, a lot of times the theme and the context is given to us by the architects that we work with for various projects. And then we kind of collaborate and, discuss and come up with a more defined set of things that make the story amazing or powerful or contextual.
I think it's sitting with creative minds like you that I have sort of evolved within my own processes in life as well. I think I always start with why. The why is very important.
Yeah.
So there was this invite yesterday which happened. There is an event happening in, Yashobhumi, and, February, we're going to do this, we're going to do that.
Yeah.
I was like, fine, you do all of it, but why are you doing it? What is the why behind it? And the gentleman had no answer. So I think there is still that evolution to happen,
Yeah.
and we need to first assert the why, which
The
is
why.
very interesting. You talk about the art of design, where art becomes a narrative translation. And it's not just decoration, right? So can you break down that framework for us a little bit?
So we call it the art of design because the art that we create comes from a design process.
Okay.
And when I say design process, we have been trained to think in a certain way. I studied at NID, and we were trained to think of the methodology that you start with defining what the problem is, and you create a problem statement. And once you have the problem statement, you research the problem statement, you analyze it, you come up with divergent solutions. And then from those divergent solutions, you pick up the one that meets the brief the best. And then you create to meet that
Is it a
question.
collective call
Sometimes.
to find the best fit?
Sometimes it is a collective call. Sometimes the team, me, and the client or the architects, we sit together and we come up with a collective decision, because sometimes you have 2 or 3 ideas that all seem great. And then, you're not able to answer it, but your customer is able to answer it. Or the people who are the architects for the project, they are able to come up with answers. Sometimes they even give you thoughts and inspiration, which gives you a slightly refined direction as well.
Okay.
So it can be collective. And
When a client comes to you, whose idea or a vision or an imagination of what they really want does not really sink in with the story that you hear.
yeah.
And then, of course, the architect is backing the client up and you're faced with that dilemma. What's your situation then? How do you handle it? What do you do? Have you ever vetoed it?
Of course. I've been vetoed. And, many a times we've had to listen to the client or the architect and not given a choice. But I've noticed that wherever we have had a say, and wherever we have been able to speak our minds or come up with interpretations that, truly make sense for us, those are the best projects that happen. We get the best output, we win awards, it gets remembered, and I think it's a win-win for everyone. So I would say that, the freedom to express yourself in a design company is very important, but we don't always get it. I try quite hard to put our stamp of thinking onto every project. And one of my early bosses, Piyush Pandey, in fact, he put his stamp on every project literally that he worked on. And he was lucky that his clients really listened to him.
Wow.
And that is why he could create this kind of work. And I'm inspired to do the same thing. In fact, I'm inspired even more now after reading his book, that, you got to sit with your clients and communicate. And why is your vision the important factor in this whole masala of what you're
Do
creating?
you think it's about being more assertive?
It's about being assertive, but in a communicative way. You've got to communicate. You can't just say, okay, take the easy way out. Client ne bol diya, to main bana deti hu.
A lot of people try to do that as well
Yeah.
these days.
So rather than saying that, all right, let me just do what is told, you have to sometimes reach out to the client and say, I don't think this is going to work.
Yeah.
Why not? And explain it to the client. I think that if you're able to explain it in a simple and, honest way, then very often the clients will listen to you.
Do you think we over the time we earn the right to do that after a certain time of
Definitely. I think that's
initially on maybe it's not possible?
Definitely. I think some of my customers have realized the value of our work after the first 2 or 3 projects, and they now trust us
Yeah.
much more than what they would have in their first project with us.
Since we are discussing the philosophy of art, the art of design, I do want to add my 2 bits here because 2 of my friends, they know that I'm an atheist or an agnostic. And they both use the same word called surrender.
Called
Surrender.
surrender.
They're like, Rishabh, I think there'll come a time when you'll actually surrender. And I resonate with that word right now in what you said. When you said that sometimes it turns out really nice,
Yeah.
and you've given that creative freedom. So maybe when in the art of design and in the world of design, when you trust the person to design the right thing for you, the other person, when they understand your story, when they can maybe tell it better, in their own form of expertise, then maybe that surrender is required for things to turn out brilliantly. Yes, sometimes surrender works magically, right? Awesome. I love that philosophy that you work with. How do you ensure the line between craft and craftiness is never crossed, and that it doesn't become tokenism? You know what I mean?
Tokenism.
Yeah.
The art of
So how do you ensure that the line between craft and craftiness is never crossed? You know what I mean?
now. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, like I said, tokenism can happen, especially a lot of people do that, and they claim that they use a lot of crafts in their brand, or and large brands also that I know of has this habit of doing very little on the craft, but actually making it into a mega philosophy for the brand. I find that a bit surprising because, it doesn't show up in their products. You don't see the craft or the authentic work that you want to see. And there's a bit of disappointment when you want to go and see their products. And I think that it ultimately hurts the brand. So this tokenism should be very, very carefully rejected. I mean, it's all right up to a point to say that, I do artisanal work,
Yeah.
even though it may not be the largest part of your work. But if you're doing authentic artisanal work, it must show up in the right way in what you produce and what you offer. Also, how you communicate about it. And otherwise, I think it's going to hurt your brand.
Personally, what are you? A maximalist or a minimalist? What's Shibani's design?
So, people in the craft space typically, I think, are maximalists, but I'm not. I am actually a minimalist who uses craft. So, everything that I do needs to breathe. It needs to have space. It needs to have air around it. It needs to have light around it. It needs to have its own space. I don't put a lot of things together. I've seen maximalists who do brilliant work.
Yeah.
I've seen them doing really lovely, and I appreciate it. But when it comes to my own work, I'm always very, very minimal in my approach of how much to use the wall, how much to use the space, how much of format or canvas to leave around that artwork or around that thing. So even though I can push a lot of things into a project, I don't do that. I in fact tell my clients that, stop, do this and no more.
Yeah.
So my approach is a minimalist approach, but using a lot of texture, color, and drama in the art or in the creation itself. Within the art or within the creation, it's profuse, but
Wow.
it breathes in a space that is really minimal.
So vibrant minimalist.
Yeah, you can say you can say that. And let me ask you the same question. Are you what are you?
A maximalist or a minimalist?
Yeah.
In philosophy, in life, I think I'm a maximalist at work, and I think I'm a minimalist at home.
Yeah.
And that's how the spaces also run.
Okay.
So maximalist approach while you're working, because that requires a lot of energy,
Yeah.
and a very chill, sabai thai, cool vibe, minimalistic at home. That's how the family is also. So we are very simple thinking, but very simple living, high thinking, but yeah, still simple.
Wonderful.
That's the quintessential Banya approach also, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think we are maximalists at work and we are minimalistic at homes. I'm thoroughly enjoying this, by the way. When working with 100 plus artisan communities, how do you balance design authorship with craft authenticity?
Okay, that's a great question because to me, the question is a little wider.
Mm-hmm.
There are purists in the craft space who don't believe that one should innovate the craft, but stay true to how it has been across the years and keep the heritage look and feel alive. While I appreciate that, but to me, crafts is really an income generating activity. It has to have the context of an industry. If artisans don't get money, uh, the craft itself will die out.
Yes.
And you're not going to have anything to keep it going. And even traditionally, of course, there's been a gap of few years, but traditionally the kings and the artisans were always in touch with each other in the past. They used to stay in the same geography. They used to work together, eat together. The artisans used to build their palaces, their beds, their furniture, their the stonework and masonry. All that used to happen together. So it's not that the two are not talking. The market and the maker were talking to each other. But the last few decades, the artisans are in the villages, and we who are supposed to be the buyers are in the urban cities. So there's a disconnect that has happened. And I feel that the designer's job is to bridge that connect. That you now have to bring the artisans and the buyers to talk to each other, to expose to each other what they want. And that innovation becomes a part of what you do then. The design innovation that you do is for this context being created where the two start talking again. And therefore, the craft authenticity to me is what it is while it's being innovated. The skill is the same. You're still using the skill and you're still using the creativity and the soulfulness of the artisan. But what you are creating may be quite different for what has been created, traditionally.
Yeah.
So,
Very interesting.
Yeah.
How many artisans are you working with currently?
across the years, many, maybe hundreds. But right now, I work with a few master artisans, maybe, and their families. You could say about 100, 150 artisan families that Biodesign works with on a regular basis. We work with a few clusters in Maharashtra, the copper enamel cluster. We work with this the beaten craft from Jaipur called Pitara. We have the Tarkashi artisans in Jaipur that we work with. And we do a lot of metal related work as well. And then there's also, I have an NGO called Hand for Handmade, where we support artisans for their knowledge and skill upgrading. So especially related to technology or, understanding e-commerce, understanding smart photography, understanding smartphone business, all of that. So through that also I interact with a lot of the artisan community.
In your experience, which state of India has the richest artisan culture?
Well, most people would say Rajasthan, and it's true. Rajasthan has the most of arts and crafts that I've seen and some brilliant stuff. But they are also being exposed a lot. You know about them a lot. But states like Odisha has a fantastic repository of crafts.
Wow.
And metal crafts, applique, textile crafts, weaving, stonework, I mean, you name it. So I think Odisha is very, very rich. Gujarat, Kutch has a fantastic tradition of embroidery and textiles work. So these two states are also very prolific in what they bring to the
Very
handicrafts world. Yeah.
You've had the most fun working with?
Uh, so I did this project for the Lucknow airport. We did a beautiful textile mural for their international terminal using the textile brocades and fabrics from Varanasi and especially Uttar Pradesh. And we had to go and actually source it from there. And then we also used the local embroidery forms. So chikankari, Ari Zardozi, all of that was also used to enhance the mural. And we created this 140 feet long textile wall with applique work using these brocade fabrics, velvets, weaving work, the local organza and the local silks, along with all of these embroidery forms. And it is there in the international terminal for all to see. And it's actually a wonderful tribute to the state of Uttar Pradesh. It talks of the crafts, it talks of the monuments, and it's such a vibrant, colorful mural. I just think that that was probably one of our most exciting projects.
3 different art forms or crafts from across the country that you think culturally and of course when viewed from a global perspective should be like the top things in the world. You know what I mean? They should get their due. 3 things, 3 types or forms of craft that you think deserve a place in the world top 10 from India, of course.
Okay, definitely Ari and Zardozi work, but it has already started to see a lot of international recognition.
Where do they stem from?
Ari Zardozi, you find it both in northern India right up to Gujarat, and it's very, it covers. They do it on these carts, or they put it on a flat table and they actually embroider from below. So it is a very intensive embroidery, covers almost the entire surface. Extremely rich, extremely varied in its kind of look and feel that it can create. And Zardozi, of course, uses a bit of zari work and sequence work and all of that to embellish it. The two go sort of hand in hand.
Yeah.
And the end products can be very, very amazing. I know of many designers who are using Ari Zardozi in a very significant...
They're unique to India?
Yeah, from India. Yeah, from India. We ourselves have used Ari Zardozi in many of our works, and the results are spectacular.
Awesome.
So definitely Ari Zardozi work, I would say, is up there. I think that the second craft that is emerging right now is natural fiber products.
Okay.
So especially things like banana fiber, moonj fiber, a lot of scope for growing this industry, because you do have women entrepreneurs who are mushrooming across the country. And I've seen this in Uttar Pradesh, in Bihar, in the South, them using natural fibers. And little entrepreneurs are making beautiful baskets, bags, slippers, packaging. And it's all happening in little pockets right now. But I think it has extremely good potential to scale up, to innovate, and to truly bring to international markets in the form of a very sustainable end product. So you use a very sustainable bag that is woven from, say, banana fiber, or you use packaging that uses natural fiber. And I think that should come up on the international stage, because sustainability is becoming such an important thing as we go ahead. So natural fiber products would be second on my list, especially banana fiber, moonj fiber, etc. And in terms of the third craft, there are so many, but there's this Katha work that you get in Bengal.
Okay.
And traditionally, it was used to create blankets for using old saris, muslin saris, you created
Interesting.
quilted blankets. And it's called Nakshi Katha, the best, the most intricate form of Katha, and they used to make artworks as well as blankets, baby blankets, and all of that. It's sort of dying craft now, but it's incredible in its expression. It's so varied, it's so beautiful and rich, and can give income generation to a lot of people across the eastern states. I think that has a lot of potential for growth as well.
Lovely.
And I'd like to mention one more,
Please.
which is the Dokra craft, which is the lost wax process, which is the brass casting process of ancient tribes. It was common across tribes in the globe, like not just in India. But in India, it's still very much available. And there's a big belt of artisans, tribal artisans, who do this dokra craft using brass. And it's intricate, it's expressive, it's unique. I think that this craft, if really focused upon and innovated to some extent, can be one of the most wonderful products from India.
Where does it stem from?
It's called dokra work, and it comes from right from Chhattisgarh, and it goes right up to Orissa and that whole belt, down to Bengal and all of them. So there's a whole tribal belt that works with this craft.
Very interesting. Now a tough question. Maybe an art or a craft which stems from India, of course. You've secretly mourned because the artisans don't exist anymore, and that's a craft that died on our watch. If there's anything like that, do you think there's been a challenge?
So there's this tradition of art that combines performance. It's there are 2 or 3 traditions. There's a performance related art from Bengal called Patachitra. There is a performance art painted art called Chitrakati art from Sindhudurg district or from Maharashtra. And then you have the Fad paintings, which also has a performance angle to it. So all 3 of them, there are singers, sometimes the artists themselves, but sometimes separate set of people who sing with the art. They present the art, they tell the stories, and they sing and they perform.
Wow.
I feel that complete aspect of performance, come painting, come music, come an audience in a setting is sort of dying out. And the Chitrakati art is especially in great danger right now of dying out, because there's just 2 families who still do the work.
Wow.
And in fact, even they are losing touch with the traditional way of working. So to me, it's a loss, because unless it's preserved and given, its pride of place, it'll die out. So I do mourn this concept of losing this whole interesting wholesomeness of having an art, which is not just an art, it is also an expression, it's a poetry, it's a song, it has an audience, it's a performance,
Yeah.
all of that.
Can we do something about it even now? No?
Yeah, we can, of course.
It requires more patrons, appreciators.
Well, that's a difficult question, but what has happened is that there's no patience anymore. Maybe I'm not saying patience is the right word. When you hear the songs of these Patachitra artists, they're singing in Bengal, right? Bengali. And it's difficult to understand what they're saying, even though they are showing you pictures from their scroll while singing. But you kind of think of it as a novelty. And the context of it, of sitting under a tree, hearing this performance, is lost. So it requires some sort of re-energizing by cultural communities, or you can say by people who are involved in revival of culture, to bring it in its complete context and to be able to present it in a new way. Like even the songs can be new. Even you can have interpretations of the songs through technology. You can have a place where people come and the performance is done in the right environment. All of that. It's only when this whole context comes together that you will start to really enjoy this
Very interesting.
aspect, and therefore it'll survive.
I want to talk to you about the airports now.
Yeah.
You've done, and you are doing a lot of airports right now, especially the Lucknow and Gwalior airport, because that's a completed job and a completed project. They are monumental in scale and storytelling, of course. How did these projects begin, and what was the design intent behind making airports cultural experiences?
So we were lucky to work with some very good people at the airport sector, both the people who run these airports and the architects who had this vision of bringing the cultural arts. In fact, this is probably a mandate from the government of India to bring in the cultural arts into airports
Interesting.
and to build some kind of income generation for artisans, but at the same time create high quality work. So we were lucky to have found these architects who understood this context very well and therefore pushed us, and also played a role in bringing about this in its most authentic form in the airports, especially in the Lucknow airport. I think this textile mural I mentioned, and then other work that we have done, brings in the context of the craft and the authenticity of the place in a very interesting way and deep way. So I think that these airport projects have been very interesting because of the people who understood this context.
Interesting. Delhi has a very rich Delhi metro situation going on, right? So many stations, but they are dull. They are dead as life around it, you know. People running around it from their day to day with that struggle and with that sweat on their face while they are, of course, traveling in those metro ACs. But there is no liveliness to those metros. There's no soul to them. They kind of look like those. You have those. What are they called in the New York?
Graffiti.
No, graffiti is still okay, but graffiti is some color at least. But they have the subways, right, in the New
The
York.
subways.
They're dead. They smell. I hope we don't reach there. You know, in Delhi. Delhi has this beautiful DMRC going on and a lot of very nice metro rail connections and takes you to like 15 minutes everywhere. But yeah, maybe that is one space that we can give a little cultural liveliness to.
Oh, definitely. I think public spaces must have art in its own way. And I understand that, you don't always have big budgets to
Yeah.
bring in art everywhere. But art doesn't have to be big budgets.
Yeah.
And when you start to involve local communities and, a lot of local groups to participate in this process of creating art, you get amazing experiences created. And even in Bombay, we had these NGOs who painted up the slums and sometimes painted up the steps to the bridges and all that. And then you just have something which is very different and very enjoyable for people, because they'll stand there, they'll take a picture, they'll send a selfie to someone, and it's just fun. And I wish more of that fun comes into our metros and into our cities, because India has traditionally been art and culture prolific nation.
Absolutely, yes.
And we don't want to lose that.
Historically,
It must
yes.
stay with us. That identity needs
I
to
think a lot of cities in Gujarat and Maharashtra are jazzing up the spaces below the flyovers. A lot of spaces are being done like that now. I think even Delhi has a few, but one of the latest ones that's happened in Delhi is the UER2 highway that they've just done. I don't know if you've had the chance to go there. There's a whole underpass or a tunnel, let's call it. And the artwork is beautiful. Like it just lights up your.
Yeah.
It's a long drive. If I'm not wrong, it's a few kilometers, and you drive within that tunnel for like 15 minutes maybe. But it's art on both sides. And I thought it was repetitive, but it's not. There is a sequencing to it. There's a lot of metalwork that has happened. There's a lot of colors, a lot of vibrancy. And it just feels like it doesn't feel like the quintessential India that we know, while the art is Indian. It is amazing. I hope you have a chance to look at it. Like maybe you can look it up. on the
Sure, I'd
internet.
love to.
It is quite interesting. In Gwalior, you brought music. You brought together music, architecture, and light, right? The musical Gharana wall, especially. So, how do you translate sound into spatial form? If there's a 2 cents on that, please.
Gwalior Gharana is an important Gharana. It has its own set of grammar for the music world, and there are very well-known musicians that came from the Gwalior Gharana. Tansen is supposed to have also been a part of the Gwalior Gharana, and and there are special instruments that actually originate from this place in and around Gwalior. So we actually researched some of these ancient instruments and created murals showcasing these instruments which are specialized for this place. And we also showcased some of the maestros involved with the Gharana. And we created a kind of storyline with the concept of a raga and of a morning raga and an evening raga. And those 2 murals have the colors of that imbue the sense of early morning or late evening. And that's how we sort of conceptualize this whole music wall.
Very interesting. And the textile mural of Lucknow International Airport, it's an incredible feat. 130 feet.
About 130, 140,
Yeah. What kind of collaboration, material experimentation, and logistics go into something like that?
Yeah, so we had to actually source the fabric from UP.
Okay.
So our person had to go and recce the fabrics in Varanasi that were available, fabrics in Lucknow, the chikankari work from Lucknow. The sourcing itself was a big job. Then once we sourced the fabrics, we actually had to work with the special colors that we wanted to create a sense of the monuments, give it that grandeur of the monuments, and at the same time the beauty of UP and the rivers of UP and the colors of the earth and the water. So all of these, we had to dye the fabrics, and then finally the embroidery and embellishment happened on them using the crafts people who are known for work in UP, Ari, Zardozi, chikankari. And finally, it was all cut into pieces, stitched together. The applique work was done, braiding, cording, layering, and sometimes weaving also of carpet-like weaving. All of this was then stitched together, put together, and then installed on this 15 feet height wall with 130 feet. And it was very interesting. It was a collaborative effort. Baya, of course, did the conceptual design and the refinement of the design, but based on what the architect's vision was, their creative inclination of what they wanted. And like I said, we were lucky to have good visionaries who was directing this output. And we also had craft experts who came in, textile experts who helped us with, installing this huge piece and stitching it together without the joinery showing. And of course, we had to fireproof it with special fixtures and all of that. So it was an incredibly interesting exercise.
Creating one is one thing, and then installing it and then preserving it for years to come is another thing.
Is another thing.
Very interesting. What was this, like 100 people involved?
So,
seems like a massive job.
Definitely between the design teams, architect teams, and the textile experts, I would say there were about 30 people, and the customers team, there were 30, 40 people involved. But other than that, the artisans themselves, the dyers, the people who actually created the fabric, I'm sure would be another 50, 60, 70 people. So yeah, I'm sure that about 100 to 200 people must have directly or indirectly been involved in creating this whole.
What is the type of the fabric used in that?
So we used a lot of the local fabrics. Actually, velvet is a local fabric from this region.
Interesting.
And then we used organza silk. We used the Banarasi brocade silks, the Baduhi carpet weaving that also we brought in.
Interesting.
So yeah, these were some of the fabrics.
When public spaces they become canvases for art, what impact do you think this has on how people perceive design in their day-to-day life? Because we were talking about metros, I was talking about all these public spaces, and you're talking about the UER too. You're talking about. I just want your 2 cents on how do you think people perceive this in their day-to-day lives, and does it actually have an impact on their? I don't know.
It's been proven that places that have art, places that have greenery, are happier places. It's a proven scientific thing. There is lots of research on this. And I think where you have art, you have happy people. It's not that they look at the art and wonder about what's the meaning of it necessarily. Sometimes they do, which is great. But it's just a place to be happy, a place to interact, a place to be social, a place to talk about something, a place to say, hey, let's stand there. You see that figure? We'll go make a pose with that figure. It just livens up life wherever art is there.
Yeah.
So to me, it's also very important stress buster for people who involve themselves in this process of making art. So to me, art is a very integral part of life, of living. It should not be divorced as a specialist thing at all.
From airports now on to the IIM Ahmedabad's IMDC building.
Yeah.
Your work explores the future through heritage. How do you design for institutions that represent intellect, innovation, and sustainability all at once?
So institutions, again, especially, institution like the IIM Ahmedabad, which is an internationally renowned institution, needs to, reflect their philosophy and their beliefs, not only to their students who learn in the campus, but to everybody who visits them. And when they have the opportunity to do so through the art, it makes a larger than life statement. Because then the institute is saying that, we believe that we create future leaders. We believe that sustainability is important. We believe that the cultural aspect of the state that we reside in is important. These statements actually give the persona of the institute. And I think through the art, we were able to communicate that. It's very important for institutions who want to talk about what they stand for through the art that they have on campus. So that has been our approach. Yeah.
I studied at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Winters are harsh. Like the lowest temperature I saw there was -24. But the diag and the entire walkable way that they had within the campus, especially South Campus or the Central Campus. I was an engineering student, so I was at the North Campus. We used to walk around, walk to the Ross School of Business on the diag, through the diag. There was this rotating cube which was pivoted on one of the corners of the cube, and you can push it and it turns. That cube was also installed later at the North Campus. There were a lot of different sculptures which were made. One I saw was at, I went to MIT for a certain project for 2 weeks. There is this, how do you call it? Have you seen Harry Potter? There's Voldemort, right? So there is this whale of a human shape that it takes before it becomes a human form. But that whale was created out of alphabets and was created, and it was just there with 2 light fixtures, and you can actually stand under it for some reason I remember these things. There was this whole movement to it, and when we used to spin the cube, it was said that it was lucky to do that.
Yeah.
And I think it was not just lucky to do that. I think it was that one moment within that gloomy weather for us to be playful, for us to be a child again,
Yeah.
when we were trying to be grown-ups or just approaching being grown-ups.
Yeah.
It was such a fantastic experience. And you're walking amongst trees. The fall had happened, winter was there, the colors had vanished.
Yeah.
It was just crazy. I get reminded of these things while talking to you, but
Yeah.
beautiful memories to have.
Yeah.
The SVJ house, your own home, is a living laboratory of your philosophy, from teakery work to copper enamel Van Gogh. Tell me, what's it like to design for yourself after designing for everyone else?
So it was interesting to design for myself because I really had to pick and choose what I wanted. There's so many crafts I like. And I had to really think about one or two pieces that I believe in. And what do I want to say that that I want to create. And so one of the artworks that I created was with this Ari Zardozi work called it's a Rumi quote, based on a Rumi quote. I searched through many things, and then this quote really spoke to me, that wherever you are or wherever you're standing, be the soul of that place. So I that stuck in my head, and I mulled over it. I thought about it 3-4 times, and it was incredibly hard to visualize that. So how do I visualize something like this? And we tried so many approaches, and magical deer, forests, and this and that. But ultimately, I said that I have to involve an artist. And there's this artist called Anila Govindappa, who does really incredibly interesting work, and he's a contemporary upcoming artist. And my architect suggested, why don't I talk to him? And we spoke with him, and he created these little scenes of village life, which were outstandingly profuse and vibrant, each of them. So there's a little bus going down the villages, very colorful. There's a coconut tree, and there's a little bunch of children playing with each other, sitting on each other's heads. Then there was one place where you had these profuse orchids, And when I looked at his visualization, I said, yes, this is it. This profusion of happiness in all of these is being the soul of the place. And then Anila kind of created this whole visualization for me. And then the Ari workers and did the embroidery for me, brought it to life. And, I was constantly in touch with them, saying that this color, that color, how much to use, is it too red, too pink, so on and so forth. But we created this very profuse, vibrant piece, which is one of the most captivating pieces, I think, in our house. So that was a very interesting piece of art. And of course, I also used my antique puppets, 100-year-old antique puppets, leather chateau puppets that I had bought during the COVID period from artisans from the south to support them. But eventually, I used these puppets to create a really lovely installation in one of the rooms. And the tikri work came as an inspiration from the architect. He said, why do you need a chandelier? Let's create this sparkling mirror work inside a dome in your ceiling. So it was, a mix and match of working with the architect and these artists, and choosing and picking what I like, choosing and picking what subjects I need to represent in the house. And of course, take into consideration what the family wanted as well. It's not just me staying in the house. So it became a very good amalgamation of everybody's identities as we kind of created for the home.
Very, very intrigued, and I'm going to self-invite myself to her place now.
Of course, anytime.
I'll be in Mumbai and I'll ring you up
Definitely.
beforehand, and I'll show up, and I
we'll
really
look
want to
forward
witness
that.
it. Top 5 Indian artists, in your opinion, who are legends of the Indian art scene?
So the top 5 would be M.F. Hussain, Paresh Maiti, Thotta Vaikuntham, then Subodh Gupta, Kishan Khanna.
Okay, awesome. 3 or 5 artists, depending on your choice, how many you want to say, that who are selling their art, let's say for symbolical reasons, who are selling their art for thousands today, but their art would be worth millions in the future.
So I'm going to name some cultural artists also in this.
Yes, please.
category.
Yes, please. Absolutely.
So Venkat Sham, Kalyan Joshi, Anwar Chitrakar, fabulous artists. I think that they have loads of imagination and are just wonderful contemporary artists apart from being cultural artists. In terms of upcoming artists, I think there's a guy called Pawan Kavitkar. I like his work. And I love the work of, I also love the work of Anila Govindappa.
Okay.
Yeah.
In your opinion, these are the artists that we should invest in today. They'll be like great investments for the future, right? Interesting. Okay. Maybe a few artists you think are secretly overrated.
That's a really difficult one.
Fair.
Oh gosh. I think, I think I have never understood the art of Andy Warhol. He's a big name, but I don't get it.
Oh.
And then there are these artists who create these Buddha paintings, and sometimes it just doesn't convey anything much to me. Like, the things that Buddha stood for are beautified, and you create these little very parlor art kind of thing. I think there are a lot of young artists who are doing that. I mean, I don't know how to name them, but there are a few that I've seen, like Purnima Gupta and others who are creating pretty art, but not evocative.
Interesting. Do you believe that India can lead the world in craft-based sustainable design the way Japan did with minimalism, or the Nordics they did with functionalism?
I think definitely there's scope for India to lead in craft-based design. We are one of the few countries in the world who have this living heritage.
Okay.
We live with that craft in our country, but we ignore it because there's so much of it that we think it's not important. But actually, no other country has access to this kind of huge variety and immensely, involved skills that are there. And if we choose to make that into a statement for the world and invite the world to participate with us, I think there's a huge, there's a very important vision and a very important, what should I say, a very important way of being that India can bring to the world.
Interesting. If you had to reimagine design education in India, what would you add or remove from it today?
Good question, because I was just contemplating that question with the design university that's coming up. To me, of course, everybody is saying that, and I agree, critical thinking is very important. But if you step beyond critical thinking and say, how does critical thinking become important, then it comes to the question of identity.
Yeah.
You have to have a context, a framework that you operate from.
Yeah.
And all of us have that context only from where we came from. Your mother, your father, your grandparents, what you ate as a child, the temples you visited with your grandmother, the trees you sat under, the villages you went to, the just the beautiful things that were created around you. Is your memory and your identity. And if you come from that context of who you are and you remember that identity really, really well, then it gives you the ability to discern for yourself what are the choices to make. In today's world, you have a lot of answers, the ready answers, this is the choice for this question. But whether this is the right choice for you and in your context is something that you have to be increasingly discerning and self-aware about. So self-awareness, identity, context of who you are, rootedness is extremely important in being a critical thinker.
Very interesting.
So
If you could put one line on a huge wall
yeah.
in an architecture or design school, what would that line be?
I think that line would be think for yourself. Don't let anyone guide you into thinking something that you're not or that you don't want to be.
Interesting.
So,
If we meet again in 10 years, what would you hope that biodesign would have changed in India's built environment?
I think biodesign was one of the early pioneers of working with crafts, and I feel that we have already brought in a lot of new craft entrepreneurs who have seen us and followed in our footsteps, I would say, and done very good work, incredible work. 10 years later, I want to make this statement, hopefully in an international arena where, they say that biodesign and the crafts of India are kind of a very important thing that has come from India, a very important thought, a way of being that has come from India. And we are noticed and recognized for bringing that, not only, in our cities, in our country, but across the world. So I'm hoping that we can do that.
Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit and add one more question.
Yeah.
What does Make in India mean to you?
Well, so when I think about Make in India, I think about manufacturers who are struggling. I think about poor quality work. I think about us competing with China. I think about how we are very jugaad in our work, in our thinking, and so chaotic. So to me, Make in India is not a particularly visionary or uplifting idea yet. I really hope that Make in India goes well beyond copying other countries or being just a nameless producer. I feel that our thought process, our way of being is so unique. And we have to have more confidence in who we are in that process of our thinking. And we have to evolve as Make in India in so many different ways, not only bring the soul and the context of Make in India, but also evolve in terms of perfecting who we are. We're still very chaotic. I wish that the chaos reduces and more order comes in. I wish that Make in India becomes something that comes from the soul rather than just being a Me Too manufacturing process and industry.
One of my closest friends within the government organization says it should be design and build in India.
Yeah.
And not just Make in India.
Yeah.
Shivani, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for the time that you've given us. I know you're on a tight schedule today. I know you have a flight also later. So thank you for doing this. If you have any questions for Shivani, please write to me at India's #1 construction podcast at gmail.com. You can follow me on Instagram at India's #1 construction podcast. Throw in your questions. I'll relay the questions to her. If she has any inputs or advice to share, we'll get that back to you. Yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great day.
Thank you for bringing me here. Enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much.